Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jong. I am the evangelist for the Unreal Engine in Europe, and I'm going to talk about ray tracing of Unreal Engine 4.22, and in particular, I'm going to talk about ray tracing for games, which means a realistic near-future scenario of how to use ray tracing in games. A hybrid blend between traditionally rendered elements and some new ray tracing features, because that's what we're going to see first in the games in the near future. So we're going to talk about ray traced soft shadows, reflections, translucency, ambient occlusion and global illumination, a little bit about them, because they're very much so more work in progress or more specific. And we're going to say quite a bit about optimization and performance, exactly because we want to make sure this runs in games. This is what we're going to build. So I built a subway environment. Got a train passing through. The train is going to have a headlight illuminating the scene as it passes through. Got reflections with all the puddles and the tiles. So that's what we're going to be working on. Now, before we go there, just a brief overview of what is and isn't there. So currently in Unreal Engine 4.22, which will be released very soon, so you can very soon already start working with this, and it's already on GitHub right now if you want to compile it yourself. We'll have soft shadows for all types of lights. So that includes skylights, spotlights, point lights, all of them will support ray tracing. The reflections are there. They're well integrated. You will see just how far we can go with them. We have ray trace ambient occlusion. And we have a first pass of ray trace global illumination. Now the global illumination is very much so a first pass, okay? You can experiment with it, but it's definitely not production ready, and it's also slow for performance, so you're not going to see this in games anytime soon. Translucency is there, image-based lighting, and we have support for static and skeletal meshes, some BSP, and Niagara particles, which means that what we don't have is support for well-positioned offset, landscapes, instance meshes and foliage, cascade particles, because we're phasing out cascade, splines and geometry lots, and neither is it multi-GPU, right? So this is very much so state-of-the-art. It's coming in really hot. And we're going to have to continue working on this for the next couple of releases of Unreal. So this is going to come in the future. Right now, we're not there yet. Now, let's get going. First of all, we need to enable ray tracing. In order to enable ray tracing, you need to have a DXR, DirectX ray tracing, compatible 3D card. You need to have Windows 1809, which is the last major Windows update, Windows 10 update. You need to then run the game or the editor with DX12. I'm going to switch to the editor. I'm going to show you that here. This is my shortcut for the editor. It's running in DX12. Having done that, this is now running in ray tracing, okay? Provided that in the project settings, I also enable ray tracing on top of it. So in the project settings, I can here look for ray tracing, and you can see it's enabled. That's it. It's also going to ask you to enable compute skin cache. It's a secondary option, but it will automatically set that for you when you enable ray tracing, and then you're good to go. So what we have here in the environment now is a couple of basic, let me switch to without lighting. Let me go full screen. And so this is what I have. This is my subway station. This is the first version. This is the version I'm going to use to show you the lighting, and then later I'm going to switch to the more finished version without all those fences and such in place and with more lighting there. But you can see there's a lot of lights floating around. All of these lights are static with very low intensity. They're basically baked ambient lights. And that is what I meant in the beginning. We're going to do a hybrid between ray tracing and non-ray tracing. And that hybrid is going to work seamlessly with each other. Okay, we have, for example, a lot of lights over here. These are all baked lights. Nothing of this is ray traced. Right, let's get going. We've got this character over here, and we got a light above him. And in this light, we can say this should be casting a ray trace shadow. That casts a shadow. So it's very easy to set this up. It's very easy to switch your content over to using ray tracing. Within that light, we can then say, source radius. If I set it to 0, right, you get a very defined shadow. So the source radius defines just how soft and how diffuse the shadow is. And the same thing can be done for spotlights. So for example, this orange light I have over here, you can see currently very defined shadows. It's not very precise either, it's a bit jaggy and such. So these are non-ray trace shadows. If I go, however, to the spotlight over here, and I enable, again, ray tracing, we get nice soft shadows. It works in the same way. Source radius here controls the fall of the shadow. That's it. Right. Now I'm going to disable this light. I'm going to talk a little bit about the new rectangular lights that we've added into the environment. So we got a rectangular light. We've added this in Unreal Engine, I think 4.19 or 4.18, I can't remember entirely. It's been in there for a few versions. But when we added rectangular lights, the first time we added rectangular lights, they weren't finished, because we can't finish the rectangular lighting without also having ray tracing. So now that ray tracing has come into the engine, we have finished the rectangular lights and we extended them with functionality. So you can see if you drag a rectangular light into the environment, we get a nice soft shadow of the character over there. We can control the size of the rectangular light. So for example, you can make a very long rectangular light and essentially make that match the shapes of the light fixtures you have in the environment. That also automatically changes the sharpness of the shadow. You can see if I make it a very small area, it's a very defined shadow, right? If the source becomes bigger, it starts to diffuse, and so on and so on. Now, as part of that, we've added a few new properties that weren't here before. So we've added a barn door angle, length, and source texture. The barn door angle prevents the rectangular light from causing a very defined, you can see it's just a line, right? It's a sharp line. If I lower this, you can see this is what happens. It gets a bit more defined, it gets a bit more subtle, more realistic. So that's one property you can add. The other property is the source texture. I'm going to show you the source texture. In fact, on this light here, we're going to enable that, and here's our light. The source texture here is meant to represent the two tube lights. So this is a very nice use of a rectangular light. You wouldn't be able to do this with a point light, right? Because the light fixture is a rectangular shape. It's a long rectangular shape, and it's made up of these two tubes. So I've made a texture that looks like this, which is mimicking the tube lights. And this is now actually casting the light. So the light is now actually coming from these two thin lines that are brighter in the middle than at the end. In fact, not only does it do that, but it also shows up in the reflections. If you look in the reflections, that is the texture that we have over here. So the reflections get improved as well. If I remove this, it gets brighter too, right? Because, without the texture there's more white pixels in that area. And this might be hard to see, but this is just a rectangular shape in the reflections now, and they're therefore no longer accurate to what the light actually looks like. So that's one thing we've added. And that, by the way, has nothing to do with ray tracing. This would have worked even without ray tracing, just so you're aware. Right, so those are rectangular lights. Now we can go a step further, and I can bring in a train. In fact, over here we've got a train coming in. Right, so I can show you. Got a train. This train has a headlight. I'm going to switch to detail lighting only. I'm going to go full screen so you can see kind of what happens. So this is where ray tracing really shines through. Look, if I animate the train so it starts to drive through, this is entirely ray traced. You get really nice, subtle, soft shadows from all those bars on the platform as the train drives by. Froze for a second. The frame rate is still very much so acceptable. You can see I'm running at about 50 frames per second. So it's surprisingly performant. Now I can show you what it would look like without ray tracing, just to show you the difference between what we were used to in games and how this is going to look in the next few years. I can disable the ray tracing entirely. I have a command here that I can run, and I can say ray traced shadows. So we find shadows in here. There we are, ray tracing shadows, 0. This is what it looks like without ray tracing. This is what we're used to the last few, the last decade essentially. It's very sharp, it's very defined, it's completely not realistic. And this is with ray tracing. Okay. Now I can go another step further just to show you how powerful this really is. I can take this really large panel of light here. You see this has a long rectangular light assigned to it. I can enable that. Now that illuminates the entire environment. Obviously everything is now yellow. And one word here, if I move the train away, you can see there's no global illumination. The surfaces are very black, right? There's no bounce lighting yet. Again, you can enable that, but it's slow for performance. It's noise in there, so I haven't done that here. I'm running without global illumination on ray tracing. But just to show you how subtle the light is going to be, you can already see here a little bit on the ground how subtle the shadows are from that light panel. And as the train drives by, it's going to really nicely illuminate, darken, and then re-illuminate as the train has passed. So the train is on the way. I'm going to hold on for a second. You can see if the train now moves away, it's going to lighten up the platform in a really nice and subtle way. So you don't have any harsh shadows that appear, so it just nicely fades in. It's really, really nice to see. And again, it runs reasonably fast, and this is in the editor. So if you were to build this to a standalone application, that's going to run significantly faster than it does over here. Right. So those were the shadows. And actually, one thing I forgot. This is an indoor environment, which means we've only talked about indoor lighting. If we for a moment demonstrate some of the outdoor lighting, it would look like this. So I've got a basic test scene here with a couple of teapots. I'm going to do this very briefly and quickly, but if I add a directional light in here, this is ray trace as well. It works exactly the same way. Source angle is how soft the light is. That's it. Okay, nothing more to say there. That's a directional light. You have a skylight support as well. So here's a skylight. You can enable ray tracing on that. That works. We can see this one is significantly noisy. So again, this is very much so coming in hot, and it is work in progress. But you can enable it, you can work with it, and play with it. Right. So we've done that. And before we move on to reflections, just a word on this. So when you have an outdoor environment with a directional light, and I have a test environment here with a lot of teapots, the upper end picture is done without ray tracing. So that is using traditional cascaded shadow maps. So normal dynamic shadows. That runs at 52 frames per second. The exact same environment with the exact same view with ray tracing runs at 73 frames per second. So there are going to be cases where ray tracing will actually outperform traditional dynamic shadows. And that's a really interesting thought. So what we're probably going to see in the future, in the next few years in games, is we're probably going to get ray tracing appearing in large outdoor environments first and isolated spots here and there otherwise, right? It's kind of like we've seen already in some console games where there is dynamic shadow for the sun. So the sun casts a dynamic shadow, but a lot of point lights aren't casting shadows. That same thing is going to happen here, where the sun is going to cast a ray trace shadow, but a lot of the other lights aren't ray traced. Because depending on the polygon count, ray tracing could be performing, outperforming CSM. This is a worst case scenario for CSM, so that's why ray tracing is doing better. And also, by the way, if you got ray trace shadows on an outer environment, there is no maximum shadow range. You will never see the shadows fade out in a distance like we've all grown used to, again, the last decade. You're going to have an infinite shadow range at all times, and it might actually run better. Good. So, I'm going to switch level. And as the level loads, I'll switch back to my slides. So while it's loading, I'm using the train from Decogon Studios Clinton Crumbler, which is content from our marketplace. About a month or two, 3 ago, we started an initiative at the marketplace where we're purchasing content from the authors, and then after having purchased it from them, we're releasing it for free to the wider community. So anyone can use those assets completely for free, and we're trying to help the wider ecosystem by doing so. So we did that with Clinton's train, and I've used it in this content that is now available for free on the marketplace. Likewise, also Jacob Norris's Nature Pack from Pure Polygons. Same thing there, and both Jacob and Clinton are here with us at GDC. So if you see them here somewhere, feel free to chat with them. Cool. Reflections. This'll get fun. Reflections are really nice. You can see this is the actual level we're going to work with. This is the finished level. All of the lighting in here is baked. So none of this light is ray traced, and that's what I mean. We're doing a hybrid between the two, and because of that, we're getting pretty decent performance. So the only lights that are ray traced here are the 3 red lights. That's ray traced over there. This one is ray traced. That one is ray traced, and the train that would come through the tunnel is ray traced. Everything else is baked. But we're going to talk about the reflections. Okay, so here we have a mirror, and you can see just how sharp the reflections are. That is the reflection. It's hair sharp. You get a little bit of noise if you move. You can see it gets a little bit, there's a bit of jagginess in there. But if you stop moving, this is absolutely hair sharp. I can show you, in fact, how it would look like without ray tracing. And it's a pretty immense difference. Okay, so if you had to turn off reflections, this is without ray tracing. That's what we had before. Okay. Now, if you look at the reflections, you can immediately spot it's a little bit black here, right? There's a lot of black surfaces in there. The reason why there are a lot of black surfaces in there is because currently the ray tracing is only set to a single bounce. So it will only do one bounce, reflect, and bounce away. And that's where it bounces to. That's what you're seeing in the reflection. It doesn't do a second bounce. Doing a second or third bounce is pretty heavy for performance. So we have that turned off, but I can bump it up. In fact, that thing in the middle there is a post-process volume. In the post-process volume, we've added a number of new options for ray tracing. For example, ray tracing reflection, and here I can set maximum number of bounces, right? So if I set that to 2, you can see, and I can set it to 3, and I can keep on going. It actually lights up correctly. Again, my frame rate dropped to 30 frames per second, and that's not even looking at the environment, right? So you can see it does do a significant bump. I'm at 90 frames per second. I'm at 30 frames per second. So it is really heavy to do that. If you're doing this in a game, the best thing to do would be to avoid environments where it's very obvious that it needs more than one bounce. So in this environment, it's very obvious that it needs more than a single bounce. Preferably don't do that. Try to hide it, right? Good. Let's move back. Also, one thing about shadows. I got this mirror here under the ground, and then move the mirror up. And if you look in the mirror, you can clearly see the shadows in the mirror are different from the shadows in the actual world. That is because the shadows in a ray trace reflection, because of optimizations, are going to render as traditional dynamic shadows, not as ray trace shadows. And you can see this again in ray trace reflections, shadows, harsh shadows. I can set it to disabled, obviously disables the shadows, or area shadows, which is the more accurate soft shadow one, but it's very noisy, and once more, it's coming in hot, so some of this is definitely work in progress. Good. Now, the reflections have a very big impact on performance, as already hinted on. We're going to get back to reflections at the end, but before we go there, I just want to give you an overview of some of the other features. Translucency is a special case. It's also performance heavy. So I have it disabled in the environment right now, but I can enable it for you so you can see the difference. Delete that one. And let me bring in the train. So here's our train. You can see if you look at the window, there is no reflection. If I look to the side, I can see the reflection fade in. That's because it's a screen space reflection by default. Ray tracing is not enabled on the window. If I look at the post-process volume again, which I still have selected here, and I look at the section called translucency, I can here say what type of translucency do I want. I don't want raster, I want ray tracing, and you can see that immediately sets it over to ray tracing. Now again, work in progress. It doesn't do a second bounce. So you can see this is black. Even if I were to change the number of bounces, that currently doesn't impact translucency. But it's getting there. And again, feel free to play with it, experiment with it, and see where it takes you. Likewise, so you have ambient occlusion. And a lot of these can be configured. At the bottom, you got this the console. A lot of these can be configured by typing ray tracing in there. And these are all the options you've got to work with. And for example, you can see there we have ambient occlusion somewhere in here. Ambient occlusion, I can enable that. I haven't done that here. I couldn't really spot much difference in my dark underground environment. It might be different if you have an outdoor environment, you know, a very bright outdoor environment. But in my case, I disabled it, saved a little bit of performance. And also you got global illumination. So this is how you would enable it. Again, experiment with it. It's heavy, it's noise, but it's really, really cool. Once we got more hardware power to drive this forward. Right. Now, before I'm going to continue with talking about performance and optimization, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview and some tips on profiling this. And then I'm going to go to specific tips and tricks. In order of performance relative to visual impact, the soft shadows are by far the best option. So what we're going to see first in games is a lot of ray trace soft shadows. You can have 7, 8 lights is what I tried in my environment, all soft shadowed, and performance would still hold up perfectly okay. Okay, so they're very performance. Then reflections. Reflections are very heavy, but they're also very visible. Right, so they're expensive, but you get a lot in return as well. So because of that reason, that's probably something we're going to see in games relatively soon. Maybe only in specific parts of the world, but we're going to start seeing that up here. Translucency is a special case. It is a bit heavy. So for that reason, I think that probably might be a step that might be skipped in some of the early implementations of ray tracing in some games, right? They're going to fall back on rendering translucency the traditional way. Ambient occlusion, again, it's not very expensive. It works pretty well. It just isn't very visible in my experience in, for example, my environment. So for that reason, kind of depends on the content. Global illumination, really cool, really expensive, and work in progress. So that's going to take at least a few years, I think, before you're going to see that appear in games. As well. So, as you have seen, you can use a post-process volume to modify some of the settings, and some of the other settings are currently CVARs that can be set as well. So those two are controlling ray tracing. You can use stat GPU as always, and stat GPU now shows you the cost of ray tracing. So you can see a lot of ray tracing topics in here, and you can see just how expensive the reflections are. This is 24 milliseconds just for the reflections. It is expensive. The GPU profiler also shows you the same thing. In fact, you can use NVIDIA Insight to get an additional look into, an additional profiler that shows you a little bit more information. All of this is supporting ray tracing and or implementation. Likewise, so NVIDIA has released a lot of tools, all of them ray trace ready, shader bind table, acceleration, structure view, etc. A lot of these are very technical. If you're an artist or a designer, this is above you. But if you'd like to look into how ray tracing works and where the expense goes, you can analyze the rays as they're being cast. But let's go take a step back and approach this from an artist angle, right? If you're an artist and you're working in the editor, what are some of the things you have to pay attention to when you work at ray tracing? Some of it is really special and kind of strange. I didn't consider these things when I started working with ray tracing. It's a different way of looking at it. I'm going to start with the easy and simple things, which is screen percentage, max ray distance, and max ray distance. You can see in the blueprint of my level, I added a few commands here, right? So I turn off aim with occlusion here. I set max ray distance, so you can do R ray tracing, reflections, max ray distance, and you can limit the length of the rays. So by doing so, you gain a little bit of performance. So you make sure that when the ray goes away, it stops at a certain point, thereby saving. It's not going to do much, but you're going to save a little bit of performance. You have ray tracing, reflection screen percentage. So essentially, you can downscale the quality of the reflections. You can set it to 50 for 50%. That does a lot to performance, but you also get some rendering artifacts at the moment, and obviously the quality is reduced. So you kind of have to see if it's worth it or not, but it's definitely an option. I currently have that disabled, so that's why it's disconnected. You can disable specific features as well, especially for translucency. For example, you can say in translucency, use ray trace translucency, but do not show this or this thing in the reflection. For example, I can disable the fog. Saves a little bit of performance again. Other things you can do too, again, for the translucency, max ray distance, and so on, right? So those are some of the simple options you can play with. But where you really have to start thinking about how you use ray tracing are the materials. In fact, I've made a debug viewer, and this is not part of the engine, this is part of my project here. But in the post-process volume, I made a post-process blendable, and if I enable that, it looks like this. And what we're doing here is we're trying to show the cost of the materials, the cost of the pixels of those materials to ray tracing. Because what ray tracing does is it gets more expensive dependent on the normal and the roughness values of your materials. So if you're going to create content, you have to very actively think about what roughness did they assign to my material. Because, look, imagine you got a flat surface and it's a perfect mirror. It's completely smooth, 100% reflective. As the ray goes down and it hits the surface, it's very easy to predict what it's going to do. It's going to do that and it's going to go away. So that's a very simple calculation, doesn't cost that much. If you have a surface that is completely not reflective, right? So for example, the surface of this desk here, when the ray hits that, what we do is we simply kill the ray because we've detected this is not a reflective surface. This is not going to do much. It doesn't, it's disabling ray tracing on those pixels. So this is rendering really fast. This will fall back on standard screen space reflections and reflection captures. So anything that doesn't show ray tracing very obviously will fall back on very cheap reflections, the reflections we had before ray tracing. So that's everything that's green. Green is falling back on that. Yellow is everything that's 100% reflective, so it's a very simple calculation. But if it's in between those two extremes, so if it's a little bit rough, or it has a very aggressive normal map, when the ray then hits the surface, it doesn't just bounce in a predictable way. It has to do a much more complicated calculation to figure out in which direction it will bounce or diffuse. That is expensive. So what we will get in games in the next few years is we're going to get games that are either very reflective or very not reflective. You cannot do in between the two, because that's expensive. So when you see games that are super reflective, it's not just because they're trying to show off ray tracing, it would actually render faster by doing that. That's interesting. And that's what I had to do here too. I made this debug mode that shows that, and I had to go through my materials, and I had to tweak them to make sure that either it's extremely reflective, like the tiles, right? Or either it's extremely not reflective, like the ceiling. It's never in between the two. In fact, the materials require special attention all the way through. The complexity of the material itself also carries a cost. So the more complex the material is, the more instructions you have in the materials, the more expensive that is for ray tracing in general. So you want to be very careful with that. We've added a node called a material switch to help with that, which I will show you in a second. And there's a command called ray tracing, enable materials, that you can use to test just how big the impact is of the materials on ray tracing. And I'm going to show you that it is very, very big. Look, if I'm here and I'm going to run that command, you can see, actually, before I go there, it's currently running at 80 frames per second, which isn't even bad. But just to show you the difference, ray tracing, which I mistyped. Ray tracing, enable materials. I do this 0. Right, I got a solid 120 frames per second locked, so it's probably a lot higher than that in reality. Now everything got black, I don't have reflections anymore, but it's still ray tracing. It simply assigns a black color to everything. You can see in the mirror here, it is still reflecting with ray tracing, it just doesn't assign the materials to it, and the performance speeds up massively. So a lot of the performance is lost because of the materials being taken into account for the reflections. And therefore, the simpler the materials are, the better it's going to run for those reflections. In fact, and this is the thing I was going to mention, we've made that material switch for it. You see I have the bench over here, and I'm going to assign this different version of the material to it. And if I do so, and I look in the mirror, that's actually red. You see, that's clearly not red over there. So we can make a material appear differently in the reflection than it actually is in the world. For the sake of optimization, or if you want, you can use it for some magical effects or some kind of creative solution. So if you look at what happened to the material here, you can see we have this thing here, ray tracing quality switch replace. If it's normal, it just uses whatever is there. If it's ray traced, it uses the color red. Now, it's a little bit weird when it's a color red, but for example, here at the bottom, you can say, you know, look, I don't want that extra complexity in the material if it's ray traced. I don't want to have the normal map appear in the ray trace version, for example. I don't want to have detail mapping appear in the ray trace reflection. Well, you can use that switch to kill that and say, if it's ray traced, just use 0.5 and don't do anything else. So that helps significantly with performance in my experience. And again, be careful with normal and roughness. Geometry as well has some specific implications when working with ray tracing. If you have any geometry with small holes or small spaces, it is going to render slower. A fence is going to render slower in ray tracing than a pillar or something. Because as the rays will go through, they will have to pass through the holes in the geometry. As the ray goes through, it needs to consider the nearby geometry and it needs to sample those polygons and that information that is slower. So fixed solid shapes are the fastest. Architecture will render the best because it's thick and solid. Indoor tends to be slower than outdoors because when the rays are cast in an indoor environment, those rays are stuck in the environment, right? As the rays cast, it bounces, it goes up somewhere else. It will now hit the ceiling or it hits something in the environment. The ray is stuck. So we have to, every ray carries a cost. But if it's an outdoor environment, some of those rays are going to bounce, or they're going to go somewhere, and they're going to go straight up into the sky, and they're going to disappear. There is no cost for them. So in an outdoor environment, say 30–40% of the rays will carry no to little cost because of that. It's faster. So you could say that the most real ray trace friendly environment is an outdoor city with no vegetation. The worst case would be a greenhouse, which is indoors, with a lot of glass, with a lot of small holes and vegetation. In fact, vegetation is slow because it has a lot of small holes, and, which I forgot to mention over here, masked materials are slow because when you have a masked material, the rays also have to consider where the material is visible or not visible, and that's an additional layer of complexity on top, right? So please do not make a jungle. That's basically the bottom line that I'll end my talk with. Great, thanks a lot.